Hey everyone, Brandon here at the Homestead. Today we're going to answer the question, what is rewilding? What's the definition for it and how does it apply to what we're doing here at the Homestead? Now, rewilding is a term that has become a little bit of a buzzword in the ecology and nature conservation space, but it still has no set definition for what rewilding actually is. And in a way, that's part of the spirit of rewilding, is it's difficult to pin down exactly what it is. Unlike traditional nature conservation practices, which centre around preserving habitats as they exist today, with all the different species present that we can observe and study, rewilding instead takes a more innovative approach and asks not only what exists that needs protecting, but what is missing that can be reintroduced. For example, here in our woodland, if we were to go by traditional land management practices, then these tall conifer trees here, we would probably keep and maintain. However, rewilding asks us to look at the landscape and monitor what nature wants to do rather than what our scientific observations are telling us to preserve and maintain. And so the spirit of rewilding is often encapsulated by the phrase, letting nature take over. And so some of the most famous examples of rewilding in action are the Knepp estate in Sussex, which I was fortunate enough to visit back in April of this year for Earth Day. And so the Knepp estate is really special because about 30 years ago, the entire estate was an intensely managed arable farmland and dairy farm. However, as Isabella Tree tells the story in her incredible book, Rewilding, due to intensive use of pesticides and artificial fertilizers, the farm stopped being productive and it was costing them more to run it than they were making back from the farm. And so Isabella Tree and her husband Charlie Burrell, the owner of the Knepp estate, made the bold decision to stop farming and simply allow the land to do what it would naturally do. And for this experiment, they relied on the help of certain ecologists like Frans Vera from the Netherlands, who ran the Oostvaardersplassen project just outside of Amsterdam, which was essentially an experiment to see what would happen if you let hundreds of square miles of reclaimed land just simply follow its own course without turning into agricultural fields or trying to urbanize it in any way. And what that experiment showed was that within record time, endangered species of birds, small mammals and reptiles all returned to the area and created what is now known as one of the first successful rewilding projects. And so at the Knepp estate they followed this example, and after they stopped farming they simply allowed plants that wanted to grow, animals that wanted to be there, and now the Knepp estate is home to various different species of endangered butterfly like the purple emperor, which is seldom seen elsewhere in the country, as well as the largest populations of turtle doves and nightingales, which have rarely been seen in the UK for the last 5 decades or more. And with that daring decision, the people at Knepp really changed the whole conversation around nature conservation, that's a tongue twister, and showed that perhaps the best way to allow nature to flourish is not to manage it intensely, but instead to sit back and allow nature to take over with as little intervention as possible. Of course, for certain legal reasons and health and safety reasons, these rewilding projects cannot just be left to their own devices. Of course, they do need some intervention. But overall, I guess you could sum the spirit of rewilding up as this. Rather than managing nature intensely, you instead learn to trust nature and allow the processes that want to happen. And so, as I said, given how groundbreaking these rewilding efforts have proven to be, the term rewilding has become a little bit of a buzzword in the sphere of ecology and nature conservation. However, as both Paul Jepson and Ken Blythe argue in their fantastic book rewilder. Many leading rewilders are motivated by visions of working with recovering forces of nature to develop nature-based solutions to contemporary social, economic, and environmental challenges. Although a scientific definition has yet to be agreed, there is an emerging consensus that rewilding aims to restore food webs, natural disturbances, and disperse, and that the interactions between these ecological processes foster complex and self-organizing ecosystems. This is imbuing the conservation movement with new purpose, ambition, and confidence, and the prospect of positive 21st century environmentalism that acts to recover our planet's biosphere for the benefit of all life, human and multi. And so perhaps it is because rewilding is such a grassroots, almost anarchist movement in the sphere of environmental conservation that it has become such a popular topic of conversation. However, Jepson and Blythe also do warn how the term rewilding could be hijacked or misused in certain spheres. For example, one practice that is often equated with rewilding is the buzz around de-extinction. In other words, genetically modifying existing species so that their offspring will mimic the characteristics of certain extinct species and therefore play the same ecological role or fill that same ecological niche within an ecosystem to help kickstart certain processes again that will have a downstream effect on the health and biodiversity of that environment. However, many ecologists argue that the whole concept around de-extinction is really sort of a fad, and that while it may be beneficial to reintroduce those lost characteristics, we don't necessarily need to quote unquote experiment with certain animals to do so. And so while one of the core focuses of rewilding is reintroducing lost species, whether it be plant or animal, trying to artificially recreate lost species is not necessarily at the heart of what rewilding is all about. So it's not about bringing back the species in particular, instead it is about bringing back those ecological dynamic processes in the environment. For example, here in a woodland environment, a species like beech plays an invaluable role in the composition of the woodland. However, it wouldn't simply be enough to plant thousands of beech trees in a field in the hope that it would create a dynamic and thriving woodland ecosystem. Instead, what you will have there is a monoculture plantation where there is so little variety between the species that the woodland as a whole would likely not even survive, and if it did, it would suffer from such a lack of biodiversity that you wouldn't even be able to call it a woodland, much like many of our monoculture coniferous plantations that we call forests or woodlands in the country today. And so the lack of a standardised definition of rewilding is both at the very core of what rewilding stands for, and yet at the same time is a bit of a double-edged sword, because if rewilding efforts are to be adopted and integrated globally so that we can begin to really see the decline of nature bounce back and ecosystems recover worldwide, then of course there should be standardised protocols and practices that need to be met if the project is going to be considered rewilding, and if the project is also going to bear the fruits of what certain rewilding projects have already shown is possible. But I think part of the beauty of rewilding, not only as an emerging social movement, but as a potential future for nature conservation, is that it doesn't have to be on such a big scale to be considered rewilding. And the fact that it lacks such a concrete structure really sets it free and means that anyone can rewild and not be held back by scientific dogma and bureaucracy. And so while others may disagree, I would consider what we are doing here to be rewilding, restoring this ancient woodland to a more natural state by not only protecting the species that are already present here, but by observing what is happening in the ecosystem and targeting certain threats like invasive species, and of course reintroducing those lost native species that have an invaluable effect on the biodiversity and biodynamism of the environment here. Now, how does this all apply to our work here at the Wellstead? Because you will often hear me saying that what we are doing here is rewilding this woodland. But how can that work in not only such a small area like this woodland, which is only 9 acres, but in an area that is relatively already quite wild? And of course, woodland management techniques are completely different, almost polar opposite to what you would consider rewilding. Instead, what I mean by the term rewilding, in reference to what we are doing here at the Wellstead, is really about just restoring the woodland to its natural state. Now, of course, that is a difficult term to pin down, and due to certain phenomena like shifting baseline syndrome, which is a key idea to understand in the sphere of rewilding, then it is, of course, almost impossible to define what a fully natural woodland would look like. All we can do is use our knowledge and our skills to the best we can to take better steps forward in the future with the wisdom of ecology and nature sciences behind us to really inform our practices. It's not about rewilding this area, as I said, in the same way that an area like the Knepp estate or the Oostvaardersplassen could benefit from rewilding. In fact, I don't think that is even possible in an environment like this. And so instead of simply letting this woodland be, there are certain measures that we have to take if we want to see this woodland return to a more biodiverse and, quote, natural state. And so for us, rewilding is just about bringing this woodland back to a state in which it requires as little management as possible, but of course understanding that it will always require management, and that is just inherent in woodland management and forestry. But rewilding can be practiced and integrated on almost any scale, and I think that's probably why it's been such a profound and inspiring movement and has really reinvigorated the ambition, as Jepson and Blythe mentioned in their book. If you have even a tiny garden, or if you own some land like this, then rewilding is a great opportunity for you to give something back to the natural world, and also for the natural world to give you something unspeakable in terms of its benefits and the joy it will bring to your life. If you have a garden, for example, rather than mowing the grass and maintaining a pristine grass lawn, instead you could perhaps look at introducing some wildflowers which will bring back pollinators, and those pollinators will bring back different insects and birds, and your garden will become this thriving ecosystem of its own, which will provide benefits extending beyond your small patch of lawn. And if you do own some considerable acreage of land, perhaps consider designating even a small part of it that you can just fence off and perhaps plant some trees and shrubs and again wildflowers, and just let it be and see what happens. And I think this is also a conversation that we can have on a social scale, where rather than maintaining lifeless, clean streets, instead we can look at integrating some more trees in our landscapes. And again, wildflowers are the best place to start. Just plant some wildflowers and you will have a beautiful flower garden, which might not be full of roses and azaleas and be as perhaps picture perfect, but the life that you will witness just from that one small step is far more beneficial than I think many people realise. And that's why I think rewilding is something that should really be given a shot on a wide scale. And if you're interested in having these conversations about nature conservation and movements like rewilding, then consider subscribing to the Wellstead, because what we're doing here is very difficult, but I think if we can build this community and have these conversations, then what we're doing here can be a real shining example for nature restoration on a small scale and on a large scale as well. Thank you for watching, everyone. I'm Brandon at the Wellstead, and I will catch you in the next video.